Welcome, everyone. So happy so many folks are able to join us today for this important briefing on voices of the AAPI community, AAPI views on Trump Day One policy priorities. I'm Bob Sakaniwa, Director of Policy and Advocacy at APIAVote, and I'd like to thank our partner API Data and Asian American Journalists Association for co-hosting this very timely briefing on the AP NORC survey, taking the temperature very recently of our community on some of the pressing issues we're all facing today. I think, if nothing else, this week started off really underscoring how important this briefing is. I'd also like to take a second and thank Greg Orton, the Executive Director of NCAPA, for joining us during the discussion session as well. And I'll be back for that discussion, and we'll kick it over to I for her to take over, and see you again soon. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bob. And hello, everybody. My name is Ai Uchida. I am Deputy Director at the Asian American Journalists Association, where we always feel great privilege in partnering with these community leaders in these surveys and briefings. And that's because, as Bob said, Voices of AAPI briefings are an incredibly important resource of data and insights for all of our communities regarding, these timely policy and social issues. So if at any time you have questions for the group, please do drop them in the Q&A, which can be found on your Zoom menu screen. We will try to get to all of them. I also want you to know that we will have time for a Q&A session later on. But now I'd like to welcome Karthik Ramakrishnan, founder and executive director of AAPI Data, to review the main findings of the survey.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, I. Hope everyone can hear me okay. Let's go to the next slide, please. So these are the key findings in our survey, which if you had seen the report from API Data and the Associated Press and NORC, there were three key findings that we've kind of pulled them apart because a couple of the key findings actually have a couple of components to them. So here are the main findings. One, that confidence in government is very low, although slightly better than when we asked the same question a year ago. By the way, this survey was conducted in December, so it was after the November election, but it was before the new year. We got the data for analysis late December, and conducted the analysis and wrote the report and issued it a week ago. And now, as before, we have some additional time to look at some disaggregated findings. So the main findings: one, confidence in government is low. As you'll see later on, it's low not only at the federal level, but also at the state level and the local level, although confidence in government at the state and local level is higher than at the federal level. Immigration is now a top issue for our community. While inflation and economic-related concerns were top issues in December of 2023, in December of 2024, immigration shot to the top. And I'll give you my take, largely based on I would say it's very likely it's largely based on the dynamics of the campaign and the prioritization on immigration by Donald Trump and many other Republicans. The community is split on mass deportations. So we asked various questions about so-called day one priorities of the Trump administration. And what we find is that the community is effectively split. And there are big differences by partisanship, but there are other differences that we'll talk about later today. Trump improved in his favorability, while Biden and Harris actually saw a decline in favorability from when we asked these favorability questions in September of 2024. That said, Trump is still net unfavorable among AAPIs. And then finally, there's very little support for Trump's policy agenda items. The only policy that has a significant net support is eliminating taxes on wages from tips. And we know that that is a priority of the Trump administration and many in Congress, potentially with an omnibus bill that they're going to try to pass through reconciliation. Next slide, please. In terms of the deeper dives, there's a lot of data I'm going to run through, but just to present the summary at the top, there are some gender differences. Women are more likely than men to express fear and anger towards the Trump second term. They're also less likely than men to hold a favorable opinion on Trump. Interestingly, there's no statistically significant difference in gender on men and women seeing abortion rights or reproductive rights as a major threat in 2025. In terms of age differences, there are some important age differences to note. Younger APIs, those age 18 to 29, are more likely to oppose policy moves on deportations, rollbacks in clean energy, and reductions in the federal workforce. Young members are also more likely to have unfavorable views of Trump and to see greater threats to various rights. Interestingly, older APIs, those age 60 and above, also see major threat to various rights. There are some nativity differences in ways that might be surprising. The native-born are more fearful of a Trump second term than the foreign-born, although that might change in the future. Remember, the survey was conducted in December. That might change in the future when given the new executive orders on birthright citizenship and immigration enforcement. The foreign-born are also more likely than the native-born to favor mass deportations. This is something that's important to keep in mind, especially the kinds of narratives that take hold in different groups of our community. Finally, in terms of ethnicity differences, Japanese Americans and Indian Americans are the most fearful for a second Trump term. Filipinos have the highest Trump favorability of all AAPI groups. On major threats to rights, their differences by ethnicity vary according to the particular threat that we're talking about. Korean, Chinese, and Filipino Americans show the highest levels of support for mass deportations, although there's opposition in each of those communities, certainly. And then Filipinos show the most support for pardoning January 6th participants. Next slide. Okay, so a lot of these graphs you'll see in the report that we issued already last week, and I'll ask my colleagues if they can drop it in the chat in terms of, you can find it on our main website under data. You can also find it under surveys. So one of the big stories is how immigration has jumped as a priority issue from 29% saying that it was an important issue in 2023 to 42% in December of 2024. Other issues like inflation continue to remain important. That is not a statistically significant difference between 31% in 2023 and 32% now. Healthcare reform is slightly less salient now than it was a year ago. Next slide. In terms of trust in the federal government, state government, local government to do what is right for you or your family, we see the lowest levels of support for the federal government, more support for state government, and the highest levels of support for local government. But even so, only 26% said they trust their local government all the time or most of the time. Next slide. In terms of various emotions that people are feeling at the prospect of a Trump second term, we see that fear is the response that receives the highest mention, with 42% saying that it reflects their feelings extremely well or very well. 34% say the same in terms of anger. Satisfaction and excitement are a lot lower, but as you can imagine, Republicans are much higher than independents or Democrats when it comes to expressing satisfaction and excitement. By the way, we're going to be uploading a PDF of crosstabs by gender, age, nativity, and party identification to our APIData.com website. Where you find the survey, you will soon also find the drill downs in terms of numbers for all these various questions. Next slide. Now, when it comes to day one priorities or week one priorities, we did our best to try to guess what would actually come through. Now, we know now that tariffs, right, either general tariffs or tariffs specific to China have not come to pass, although President Trump still talks about that as occurring potentially on February 1st or in April after a review of various trade agreements and their effects on the American economy and American society. That said, many of these other policies have either already been part of executive orders or intended to be part of congressional legislation. As I'd mentioned before, eliminating taxes on earnings from tips is popular in our community. 48% favor, as opposed to 22% who oppose. When it comes to deportations, the community is split about even in terms of favoring it as opposed to opposing it. And it's also a split when it comes to significantly reducing the size of the federal workforce. This is a priority of the so-called Department of Government Efficiency that has been announced and that is doing its work, although it's subject to litigation at the current moment. When it comes to climate policy, you see opposition to increasing oil drilling on federal lands and rolling back federal investments in clean energy projects. You also see opposition to general tariffs, as well as specific tariffs, additional tariffs on goods imported from China. And then we see strong opposition to pardoning most people who participated in the January 6th, 2021 attack on the US Capitol. Next slide. A couple of other slides before we go to deeper dives. Majority of API adults have little or no confidence in Trump's ability to govern in key areas, including effectively managing the White House, effectively managing the military, effectively managing government spending, and appointing well-qualified people for his cabinet and other high-level government positions. There are partisan differences, which you will see in the crosstabs once they are available on our website. Next slide. Now, looking beyond the management of the White House, we also asked people in terms of their confidence in President Trump's ability to deliver on some of his promises related to the economy. So in terms of creating more jobs, lowering the cost of food and groceries, lowering the cost of housing, and lowering the cost of healthcare, very little confidence that President Trump will be able to make progress on that issue in 2025. Next slide. And then finally, in terms of various rights, either that are listed in the Bill of Rights or protected under various American laws and court rulings, we see that most APIs see abortion and reproductive rights as under threat in a major way in 2025. Significant number also see the freedom of the press as under threat. 35% see it as a major threat. 33% see it as a minor threat. Only 31% say no threat at all. We also see some anxiety about freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, as well as freedom of speech and the right to assemble peacefully. We'll dig deeper into some of these fears in terms of rights being taken away in the deep dive section. Next slide. Okay, so let's go to policy priorities. So we saw that 42% prioritize immigration. What's interesting when we look at it within the community by age, for example, older APIs, and this is predominantly Asian American, by the way, in terms of the sample, older community members are more likely to prioritize it than younger community members. We see that on other issues, there's not much differences by age, although interestingly on inflation, those aged 30 to 44 have a higher concern about inflation than those aged 18 to 29. When it comes to partisan differences, the only major party differences that emerge here among the top issues are on immigration, where Republican APIs are much more likely than Democrats or independents to say that this is a high priority. On foreign policy, slightly more likely. to say that this is a high priority for them. Interestingly, when it comes to the economy in general, outside of inflation, independents are much more likely to say that this is a high priority when compared to Democrats. Next slide. In terms of particular day one priorities, if you will, from the Trump administration, when it comes to eliminating taxes on earnings from tips, there's some differences that emerge when it comes to ethnicity. Japanese Americans are less supportive on that than others, but outside of that, no major differences. You do see slightly higher support for this among those age 18 to 29, but that's not a statistically significant difference when you compare to other age groups. Next slide. Opinion on deporting all immigrants living in the country illegally. We see lower levels of support for that among Japanese Americans. You see the highest levels of support for that among Korean Americans, Filipino, and Chinese Americans. We also see those aged 18 to 29 strongly opposed to that. 62% are either strongly or somewhat oppose deporting all immigrants living in the country illegally. You see greater support among those in older age groups. Next slide. In terms of rolling back in federal investments in clean energy projects, differences by ethnicity vary, and certainly we encourage you to take a look at that. Now, as well as when you get a chance to look at the PDF of the crosstabs. But you do see a consistent pattern by age where younger APIs are more strongly opposed to rolling back federal investments in clean energy projects. Next slide. In terms of oil drilling on federal lands, a similar pattern emerges with respect to age. And when you look at the PDF, you'll see predictable partisanship differences as well. Next slide. In terms of reducing the size of the federal workforce, you see less support for that among younger APIs. Interestingly, among those aged 60 and above, you see majority support on significantly reducing the size of the federal workforce. There's some important ethnicity differences as well, with Japanese Americans the least likely to support that policy. Next slide. In terms of pardoning most people who participated in the January 6th attack on the US Capitol, generally we see opposition across the board, including for Filipino Americans, but importantly, close to a third of Filipino adults are either strongly or somewhat in favor of pardoning most people who participated in the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. This is really important because, as news coverage continues on who the people are that got pardoned, including those who committed acts of violence, including against law enforcement personnel, it'll be important to see where our community stands overall, which is in opposition to these mass pardons. Next slide. In terms of threats to rights, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly so that we can get to the discussion. Interestingly, right, no significant gender difference when it comes to seeing abortion and reproductive rights as being major, but those rights as being threatened in 2025. This is the set of rights that people viewed as having the highest level of threat in 2025. Next slide. In terms of freedom of the press, we see that young people are more likely than those in middle age to see this as under threat. We also see Asian Indians more likely to see this as a major threat than, say, Filipinos, only 25% of whom see this as a major threat. Next slide. Freedom from unreasonable search and seizure. No significant differences here to speak of, except by age. Interestingly, 40% of those age 18 to 29 say that they are concerned about threats to the freedom from unreasonable search and seizure in 2025. Next slide. And then finally, in terms of the right to assemble peacefully, you see greater concerns among Japanese Americans and Vietnamese Americans, as well as among NHPIs, as well as among those 18 to 29 and among those 60 plus. Next slide. Finally, in terms of opinions on Trump, we see, there was a fair amount of speculation in terms of how much Trump attracted younger API voters. We see that young people have much lower favorability for Trump than older AAPIs. We also see a gender gap where women hold a more unfavorable view of Trump than men do. And then you see the differences by race and ethnicity. Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, I should caution that the error bars are quite large on this, but this is a pretty consistent pattern that we've seen in our survey as well as other surveys of conservatism in the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community, where Trump enjoys majority favorability and support in that community. Among ethnic groups, we see that Filipinos are the ones that are most likely to give him support, but essentially the community is split. There have been news reports, for example, in Nevada, where the Filipino community is large, where Trump won the API vote according to exit polls in Nevada. Next slide. In terms of emotions, we had seen those findings overall. We find that fear is higher among Japanese Americans and Indian Americans. Next slide. It is also higher among women than among men, and it is highest among young people and, interestingly, among the native-born. But again, these questions were asked in December 9th through the 17th, and we hope to ask this question again in the coming months to see if these attitudes have changed, given what is now being revealed with executive actions and planned congressional legislation. Next slide. In terms of anger, not much difference to speak of here, so we can move to the next slide. We do see gender differences where women are more likely than men to say that angry accurately reflects their feelings about a second Trump term. No significant age differences. Next slide. Okay, so to recap, you see some gender differences as we've summarized, we've talked about before, especially in terms of emotional reactions to a second Trump term. There's some significant age differences that emerge consistent and throughout. There's some counterintuitive differences by nativity, but for many of us who know our communities, it makes sense that the native-born may be more sensitive to rights erosion than the foreign-born. And on deportations, we actually see the foreign-born more likely than the native-born to favor mass deportations. Finally, there's some ethnicity differences, some of them that are consistent, where you see Japanese Americans and Indian Americans consistently lining up on one side of the equation. But on other issues, there may be some surprising findings. And we encourage you as members of the community, leaders of the community, and journalists covering our community to dig into these findings. So with that, I'll turn it back to I.
Thank you so much for that, Karthik. And thank you everyone for your chats, or your questions rather. We do see them and we do plan to get to them in the community discussion. So a reminder to please put your questions in the Q&A rather than the chat if you can. Okay, now let's bring back in our guest, Bob, who joined us at the top of the hour. He's Director of Policy and Advocacy at APIAVote. And let's also bring in Greg Orton, National Director at National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, or NCAPA. So thank you both for being here. So it is clear from the survey that the atmosphere among our communities going into this administration is one of fear, a general perception of not feeling safe. The results also, underscoring or showing the lowest levels of trust in the federal government compared to local and state. What was your reaction to these survey findings and most important takeaways? Let's start with Bob.
Sure. Thanks so much. And that's a great question to start off, because I think it ties directly into what we just saw take place on Monday, which is the plethora of executive orders signed by President Trump. I think in the back of people's mind, what's shown by the survey is that there's this fear of kind of not not knowing exactly where uh, uh, Trump was going to be headed, and maybe there was, this desire for change or for, the price of your eggs to be lower. But, you know, people also remember the last Trump administration in the heat of the pandemic and the spike in hate crimes. And so I think, the fears were somewhat justified after the EOs came out, because we saw that even though many of these things can't be implemented right away, it's sending a clear message, and that the campaign rhetoric is now turning into action. And so I think uh, even though the fear is high, I think we're just in the first week, and I think a lot of people in the advocacy community feel like it's been, the first year already. But really, just to take one of the executive orders signed on Monday, if you look at the one associated with birthright citizenship, while some of the data in the survey does indicate, the AAPI community generally, if there's going to be any action, negative action in the space of immigration policy, we see it most when it concerns undocumented immigrants. But this executive order goes well beyond cutting off undocumented immigrants from citizenship. It also bars that for legal immigrants who can be here on a temporary visa. There is a exception for the green card holders, but clearly this goes well beyond just being focused on the undocumented community. So I think that a lot of the fears are based on not knowing where things can go, and that's been realized to some extent this week. So, but again, it's just the first week, and I'll let Greg kind of add in here.
Yeah, no, thanks, Bob. And look, I would just agree with the simple premise. Like these data points were captured before inauguration, right? It's telling us that large swaths of our community had real legitimate concerns and fear about President Trump 2.0, and we're here. And to Bob's point, within 48 hours of him taking power, there was just a tidal wave of executive order actions that aim to fundamentally change the way our country operates. And so, in some ways, to me, I interpret it as a validation of those pre-inauguration fears in terms of the point Bob was making. Another point, I think I was reflecting on this question earlier, and it just our community has been living in fear and distrust for so long, right? And it obviously stems way before the pandemic, but the pandemic is the most recent example that really highlighted the concern and fears that all of our families feel, or I would say many of our families felt and continue to feel, knowing that that environment of anti-Asian hate still exists in different ways. And so, and I see it as a continuation of the same trends, but now they're being validated in pretty stark terms by the actions taken by this administration. I'd say one of the other points that really stood out to me about this data is just this belief and little trust that exists that there will be a marked improvement of quality of life for our communities under a Trump administration. Like that data is loud and clear. And when I was thinking about this, it's just really this reflection of, and I know we'll get into some of the policy specifics that Bob touched on, but the simple fact is that Trump's priorities are not the priorities of our community, right? There's places where there might be support, there might be splits, but there's a good number of data points there that suggest that he's just way just out of touch with where our community is. And so the last thing I'll say sort of on this point about fear is, reflecting on the election, reflecting on the first administration under Trump, fear has always been this really powerful motivator, right? And when you create an environment of fear, people will naturally become more self-interested out of self-preservation. I don't blame anybody for that, right? If you make me feel unsafe, I'm going to look for a way to protect myself, protect my family. That, like I said, that's a natural reaction. But that also leaves less room for collective action, right? fear drives division, and division is ultimately required for control. And I think what we're seeing with these executive orders, and what we'll see in the future, and what's to come, is additional actions that are meant to drive this fear and ultimately keep our community separated.
Thank you for that both. And I think the question is going to be, how do we move forward from that? I would love to actually get into that later on in the discussion. But to your point, Greg, that you just made about, this sort of nuance in the political landscape, and we actually had a question in the Q&A as well. So we see, on one hand, we see support for Trump-specific agenda items appear limited among AAPI voters, but in this elections, Republicans did increase their vote share among AAPIs and among minorities in general. So why are we seeing this contrast? And to pick up one of the questions, how do you interpret not only this contrast, but like the significant proportion of responses regarding the question about Trump's policy priorities, which was slide 10, being neither favor nor oppose, and sometimes that being greater than favor or oppose. Why are we seeing a contrast here?
So I can take a first stab at this. So for the first question, as far as why we're seeing these trends over time, I certainly disagree with conservative Asian American, Native and Pacific Islanders, and can have political debates and policy debates, like very clear-eyed on that. But I think the political maturation of any community is to start to see people having different opinions on things. People who have been here for longer periods of time start to evolve their political views as a political education. So as well, it may be personally frustrating for me. I see it, I still see it as growth for our community, right? And I think it's important to sort of be mindful of that. I think another piece is, and this is me being completely honest, neither party over the last decade, 2 decades, has been particularly good about investing in our communities, right? And that translates to opportunity, right? And so as a C3, we're not particularly interested in sort of the political machinations, but we are very much interested in the investment and commitments that government, political parties make to our communities to make sure that our issues, our priorities are uplifted. And so I think when our community feels like we're not getting enough, time in the spotlight, enough opportunities to advocate to improve the quality of lives for our families, there are opportunities where certain messaging will start to break through more and more. And so, I think that's really where I'm at right now in terms of thinking about, this post-election autopsy. I mean, certainly there's plenty of factors as to why there were other swings, but ultimately, again, we just have to maintain that recognition that historically speaking, our communities have been left on the sidelines of a lot of these bigger political debates. And so I think now that people are making more appeals and we'll continue to see those changes, we might continue to see that evolution of our community's political perspectives.
Yeah, and just to kind of take kind of coattail off of Greg's comments there. I think one of the things that this phenomenon, the disconnect that you're highlighting, underscores is the need for continued voter education on the issues and policies and the things that are happening both at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level. If we're not in constant contact with our communities, that also kind of breeds distrust as well. And so we really have to redouble our efforts to be in the community, speaking our message to community members regarding policies and what's going on at every level of government. And so, at APIAVote, we're redoubling our efforts to work with our partners. We have, some 60 partners throughout the country and almost 30 states, and they're the critical link to our communities in those areas. They're the trusted messengers. And so I think what's encouraging in that context is that, as the survey points out, although not great, the most trust or the most faith people have is in their local level government, and then maybe state level, and then finally, nobody likes the federal government because it's just too big and onerous to really understand what is happening. And again, but that's on us as a national C3 to get that education out there, get those connections to policies and who's crafting them, getting those connections made so that more understanding and informed decisions are out there, especially in this environment of mis and disinformation when it's so easy to get people off track. I mean, it's clear, we previously had a White House initiative on Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders, an entity devoted to listening and hearing from our community. Day one of the new administration is gone. And so, you know, getting that information out there is critical in connecting policies again to the people crafting them. And that's kind of what we're really going to be focused on for the next, many years going forward.
Yeah, can I add something real quick? And I appreciate Bob bringing this up. You'd asked about sort of some of those polling numbers where it's like 30%, 30%, and then there's another middle 30%. For me, I interpret that as, a reminder of the responsibility that our organizations have, all of us have to make sure that our community is aware of the issues, right? I think I interpret that 30% of undecided as they either aren't paying attention to the issues, perhaps because they rightfully so are focused on raising families, making ends meet through their jobs, seeking better opportunities. And there's another factor that I think about of people who are probably simply like, I don't know what the answer is because I see so much information on both sides of this debate. I don't know what to believe. There's compelling arguments made. There's YouTube videos. There's Instagram reels. There's so much misinformation, disinformation, like Bob said. That I think drives some of that confusion. And so, sometimes when we ask those questions of how do you feel about this issue, there's reluctance to sort of speak up, or there's just a simple, I'm not sure because I've seen too much come at me to sort of allow myself to come to a sort of informed position. So I think ultimately it's on us as organizations to make sure that there's clear, concise kind of data and information and explainers of what's really happening and the stakes in terms of what is actually occurring here in DC.
That's a great point, Greg. And actually, that reminds me in a previous survey that AJ did with APIAVote and API data, we did find that a majority of respondents don't think the media is managing or correcting misinformation well, but that news organizations can build trust through fact checking. But of course, we know that that's also quite, in a challenging time. So maybe that sense of responsibility to educate to both of your points is really coming into play here. Bob, do you want to talk a little bit about mass deportation, and especially from the angle of voter education and from the lens of mis and disinformation?
Sure. I mean, I think, we're a civic engagement organization. We really focus on, the voting process, voting rights, and but part of that is, recognizing that our community is made up of immigrants and many who are, still in, whatever non-citizen status they're in, but, many who are in the process to naturalize and become eligible to vote. So obviously for our community, immigration issues are deeply, deeply impactful and an issue we ignore at our own peril. So, that said, I think, in terms of mass deportation, obviously, as Asian Americans, there's a long and terrible history of our treatment in the immigration context. But I think, a lot of that is lost, on, many of the folks currently here who, maybe they were in a green card line waiting a long time and finally were able to get that, after, a 5-year, 10-year wait. Well, understandably, they're not going to want people who are perceived to not have gone through the proper channels to get any sort of benefit. So there's that kind of tension that, really has to be, it's a real effort to kind of unpack that, because the fact is there isn't that channel for many people to come here legally. There's not even a line to get into. And yet the economic magnet of jobs in this country is never turned off. So I our community and our the AAPI perspectives on immigration are obviously very complex, and so I think the one thing we have to go back to is just immigration. No matter how you slice it, that's how we grow our community. That's how we've gotten here, and it's not just people coming across without inspection across the border. There are people who overstay their visas, and many of our own people in our communities end up in this country that way. They may have gotten opportunities but not had the right visa, and then they're not border crossers, but they're here in a now very vulnerable status. And so I think the side that's anti-immigrant, they're going to do everything they can to make sure this country makes it difficult, whether it's by changing this birthright citizenship notion, or whether it's requiring in the voting context, requiring proof of citizenship. And these things go way beyond an impact on the immigrant community, because how many people out there have changed their name so that it's not the same on their birth certificate now. Historically and traditionally, that's going to impact women who get married and have their name changed. But if all of a sudden these requirements to prove citizenship are implemented, it goes beyond impacting the immigrant community. So but obviously that's the target. And so I think, getting back to your point about mass deportation, it's not just about mass deportation. It's about our nation as a nation of immigrants, and how we're going to keep preserving that and not fall prey to, as Greg mentioned earlier, fear tactics intended to divide us.
Thanks, Bob. And Karthik, I saw your hand raised. Sorry, I'm getting to you just now.
Yeah, no, I think, and there's some questions that are in the Q&A, so I want to make sure, especially for some reporters that are coming in. I will say, folks, like on immigration, yes. So one of the questions, was about how to make sense of a significant number who say neither favor nor oppose. And I think, to Greg's point, I mean, I think, either it's an opportunity to do outreach, and I would say, for me, sometimes even things like misinformation and disinformation, I think we should be careful about using some of these terms, because they could be seen as disrespectful. And even something like voter education or community education. Education is a two-way street. There's a lot that we learn when we engage with community. And I'll say on something like immigration, as someone who has studied immigration policy for 2 decades, including at the state level and at the national level, there are things that our communities, some members of our communities have been saying for a long time, including what some people call documented dreamers, right? Children of H-1Bs who, when they turn 21, have to leave the country or find some other way of being here. Now, the advocacy community has not said much about that. We've been focusing a lot on undocumented, right? And so this is one of the ways that I think seeing the data, either with respect to what we see in our survey data, API data, we also released a set on immigration data, right? There have been massive declines in green cards in the early days of the Trump 1.0 administration, well before COVID. There are ways that we need to educate ourselves, even as community leaders, but to listen. But I will say, this notion of coming here the right way versus the wrong way, people in progressive circles might not like to hear it, but that is a dominant narrative in immigrant communities, especially among those coming from countries. You see this, for example, I believe is in Terry Tang's reporting in the Associated Press. People say, you know what, we've waited for many years to come here, and other people should just wait. So I think these voices are important for us to listen to, because many of them voted for Trump. And even if they didn't vote for Trump, they still are members of our community. And I think we need to engage in kind of respectful dialogue for people to understand the complexity of our system and importantly, ways that we need to fix it. I also fully agree with Bob. I mean, there's a strand of nativism that is now peeking through on the birthright citizenship executive order that goes well beyond, people who are undocumented, including those on temporary visas like H-1Bs. Many people would be a farce to call them temporary because they're in perpetual renewal cycles on their H-1Bs. And they've been asked to put their lives on hold and their families' lives on hold. So I think what API data is going to do is going to repeat some of these emotion questions, but we do want to dig deeper. I believe that Teresa Watanabe from LA Times had a question on what percentage of API immigrants are undocumented. It used to be 1 in 7. It's now down to about 1 in 10. But we have that data as well, Teresa, in our immigration data resource guide. And I'll ask one of my colleagues to drop that link in the chat so you can see it. It's important for us to have an evidence-based conversation on immigration. So all this notion of this border invasion or this unprecedented levels, what is lost in that shuffle is actually we saw a return to pre-Trump levels when it came to green card issuances, when it came to naturalizations, when it came to student visas. And so it wasn't an unprecedented act. In fact, the Trump era was an aberration from what we've seen over the last 20 to 25 years on immigration. So I'm hoping that journalists, but also community leaders, community members, have an evidence-based conversation rather than one that frames an issue in a very misleading way in terms of what immigration has looked like over the last few years.
Yeah, and I appreciate Karthik's point. We've talked about this at length in terms of having the hard conversations, the truthful ones about our community's attitudes and perceptions of these immigration debates. I agree. I mean, we have to confront the reality that there's a growing portion of our community that feels very strongly about undocumented immigration. And it doesn't mean that we have to sacrifice our values, stop fighting for things that we believe are right, but we should be informed by that. And I think in terms of the executive orders and this attack on birthright citizenship, they're not constitutional. And I think that's something that has always struck me is so much of our community, immigrant communities, fleeing that kind of oppression of unilateral decision making, wielding of power. These executive orders reflect that in many ways. And I think there's a ton of risk there. And to put a finer point on some of these other kind of broader attacks on immigration, the Congress just passed a bill that I think captures the hallmark of how the Trump administration messages and convinces folks and build support for their agenda. They will identify an issue and say, hey, we want to fix this issue. And it's a legitimate issue. But the solution that they put forward goes far beyond a simple fix. And so this bill that passed through Congress, again, was aimed towards addressing violent criminals who are undocumented immigrants. The actual bill that's most likely going to be signed into law, again, extends far beyond that. That's ultimately going to lead to fewer legal protections, more family separation, more deportation, and more just harm to Asian American families. And I think we have to be honest about that as well. The other thing I note on the executive order is that I do believe, to my point about it being unconstitutional, I do believe it was recently blocked by a judge in Seattle earlier today. And so certainly there'll be a lengthy legal fight around this, but it just points to, yes, we should be honest about the attitudes of our community, but we also need to recognize that there are boundaries and guidelines that this country has always operated around, and we can't necessarily sacrifice those things as well.
Yeah, one thing just as we're running out of time, I want to make sure, one of the questions was, has this survey been done before? Yes, so this is a survey that we do about every 2 months. It's incredible, right? So when I started doing survey research about our communities in 2008, we were doing surveys every 4 years. It was extremely expensive and difficult to pull off. And then with APIAVote, we did surveys every 2 years, right? Presidential and midterm. Now we're doing it every 2 months. So, but this data is only as good as people being aware of the data and then using it, right? In education of all sorts, raising awareness, making sure that we have the most accurate and updated understanding about our own communities. I'll also say to the journalists on this call, look at all the organizations that type their names in the chat, and there's so many more, right? We have hundreds of community organizations throughout the country. We believe in data, narrative, and action. So we're producing the data, but the narratives come from communities in terms of how this issue is affecting them in terms of daily lives. So I would strongly encourage journalists on the call to look at the organizations that have already put their names in the chat. If you haven't put your organization's name in the chat, please do so, so that you can be a resource to reporters that are covering our communities.
And I would love to pose this question to all three of you as we wrap up this briefing. Communities, and what do we need now? What do we and what can we provide each other that fosters a sense of safety? How do we move away from the sense of fear to a sense of security? Greg, why don't we start with you? We'll go to
Sure.
Bob and then Karthik.
So I'll say this. I think I'm thinking about that slide that captured sort of the disconnect between the Trump policy agenda and where our community stands. And obviously, it posed a number of questions. It doesn't capture every policy area, but I'm thinking about sort of one of the first major announcements that the Trump administration made related to investment into the community was this $500 billion investment into AI. And look, AI might be the future, but putting food on your family's table and providing opportunities for your kids, keeping your family healthy and cared for, those are issues of today, right? And I think that's one thing that really stands out to me is we are still waiting for how this administration plans to address the very real life issues that everyday Asian American, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders are facing, right? And I think everything that's been put out thus far is around an ideological agenda. It's a little bit less connected to those everyday issues. And so I think it remains to be seen. We could speculate a lot, but I know we're out of time, and I look forward to future conversations about this as well. But I think that's just something that really stands out to me. Our community, again, must demand sort of a seat at tables, even if the policy conversations that are being had are uncomfortable or challenging. If we don't, we're certainly not going to be included, and we've seen this time and time again throughout history.
I think the picture and the fight in Washington D.C. and on Capitol Hill is gonna really hinge on individual members of Congress and senators to hear from people in their states and in their districts. And so I think while that battle is going to be in our view mainly on the defensive to stop some of these negative harmful policies from happening, that's going to take national groups working with the state and local groups, and I really appreciate what Karthik said about how obviously national groups don't have all the answers and need to hear and understand what's happening at the state and local level. And so I think where there are opportunities for positive advocacy, that happens at the state and local level, because there the political makeup is different. And I think there are, for instance, state Voting Rights Act efforts throughout the country that are showing positive forward movement. And it's incumbent on us to really work with our partners to hear and see where these opportunities are. So even though on the federal level, again, it's going to be very defensive, I think we do have hopefully opportunities at the state and local level for some positive policy changes.
So I'll answer this question in terms of what gives me hope and also what can give our communities hope in my role as the executive director of API Data, and take it for what it is, right? But I believe in truth. I believe that ultimately truth in itself will not prevail, but it's important for us to hold on to evidence and to always hold on to that in the work that we do. You can only ignore truth like you ignore gravity for only so long. And this is true on the left and on the right. So in the last year, we saw survey after survey saying that inflation was a top priority in our community. We saw it across communities. And yet there were certain political leaders who thought that you could message that away and maybe find other issues that could substitute for that and override that. But that was an example of survey findings that were consistently showing the same signal. Now, there are other signals that potentially people would have had a theory, say, on abortion and repro rights. It seemed like that was a litmus test issue or a motivating issue for a lot. So there's certainly uncertainty about what that means politically. But I think I'll go to Greg's point. I mean, we're seeing very little confidence among API voters that prices are going to come under check on healthcare, on housing, on many other issues. That is a truth that needs to be checked, right? In terms of if part of an agenda for not only the Trump administration, but others who are running on that issue was to keep inflation in check. That is something that we can have an evidence-based conversation about. I think it's so. My hope is that the kind of data that we generate, often in consultation with community partners on demographic data, policy data, survey data, will serve as not just as a reference point, but as a resource that can be used. Because if we're moving into a world in which anything goes and it's just the power of and the sophistication of what you say, no matter what the truth is, I think we're in a lot of trouble. So I'm hoping that we can actually use that as a resource to make sure that the policies we have are sound, not just constitutional. I mean, we do great harm to the US if we pass policies that prevent people from coming into this country. And I say this personally as someone who is an immigrant to the United States. So it's something that I think that I hope that we can use as a resource in the months to come.
And for more evidence and truth-based findings, we want to remind everyone to, stay up to date on the latest with AAPI data and AP/NORC websites. You are free to reach out to any of us here with any of your questions. I want to give a shout out and thank you to Bob, Greg, of course, Karthik, and thank you so much to everybody who joined on this call. See you again.